8 seconds. In the time it takes a normal human being to draw a breath and exhale, a .338 Lapua Magnum round travels nearly 2.5 kilometers through the thin, acrid air of the Syrian borderlands. During those 8 seconds, the projectile is no longer a piece of lead and copper. It is a vessel of intent, subject to the rotation of the Earth, the microscopic shifts in humidity, and the thermal mirage rising from the scorched concrete of a dying city. It is a journey through a ballistic vacuum where the laws of physics are the only judge, jury, and executioner. In the summer of 2017, on the outskirts of a sector coalition intelligence had labeled Zone 0, a single high-value target was presiding over a ritual of slaughter. He was a commander of the Islamic State's martyrdom battalions, a man responsible for the industrial-scale engineering of suicide vests that were tearing the heart out of Raqqa. He was standing on a balcony, surrounded by a human shield of non-combatants, women and children positioned with the cynical precision of a thinking insurgent. High above, an American MQ-9 Predator drone circled at 18,000 feet. The machine of the Pentagon was locked on. The sensor operator in a trailer in Nevada could see the target's heat signature. He could see the cigarettes being passed between guards. The collateral calculus was being run in real time by a multi-million-dollar algorithmic suite. The verdict from the American command was a systemic 0. Target is viable, but the footprint of a Hellfire missile will neutralize the entire floor, the report noted. Estimated civilian casualties, 12 to 15. Mission aborted. Monitor and wait for a transition to open terrain. But the target wasn't going to open terrain. He lived in the shadows of the urban abyss. He knew that the American machine was bound by the rules of loud lethality. He knew that if he stayed close to the innocent, he was invisible to the satellites. Standing 1.5 miles away, inside the hollowed-out shell of a derelict water tower, was the British anomaly. Staff Sergeant Elias Thorne, a name redacted from every official log, did not have a satellite uplink. He did not have an algorithmic suite. He had a bolt-action L115A3 rifle, a spotting scope, and a thinking mind that had been dismantled and rebuilt by the grey men of Hereford. While the American machine was calculating the cost of a missile, Thorne was calculating the geometry of the impossible. To understand how a single man can solve a problem that a $20 million drone cannot, you have to look past the optic. You have to look into the geography of the soul. You have to understand why the SAS sniper wing is considered a different species, even within the regiment itself. Wait, before we follow the bullet into the heart of Raqqa, I have a question for the real thinkers in this community. If you were the commander on the ground, would you trust the $20 million algorithm or the finger of a man who hasn't slept in 3 days? Drop a comment below. Tech or human? We're reading every response to see where this community stands on the future of warfare. The SAS sniper does not view himself as a shooter. In the American doctrine, a sniper is often a system operator, a component of a larger tactical unit supported by a spotter, a security element, and a radio link to a quick reaction force. In Hereford, the sniper is the residue of the stalker. He is a biological sensor who operates in a state of surgical autonomy. This philosophy was born in the Highlands of Scotland during the First World War with a unit known as the Lovat Scouts. These were foresters, deer stalkers, and gillies, men who understood that the most dangerous weapon in the world is not the fastest gun, but the most patient eye. They taught the British military that a man who can sit in the rain for 3 days to watch a single deer
is a man who can dismantle an army.
Elias Thorne was the modern iteration of that ghillie. His journey to that water tower in Syria began a decade earlier, during the Hills phase of selection in the Brecon Beacons. While the rest of the candidates were focused on the long drag, the 64-kilometer march, Thorne was being watched for his metabolic stillness. The SAS doesn't just want the men who can walk. They want the men who can stop. They are looking for the threshold of the void, the ability to remain motionless until the body temperature drops, until the heart rate slows to a rhythmic thrum of 45 beats per minute, and until the self evaporates into the environment. The sniper selection is a filter within a filter. Out of every 100 men who badge into the SAS, only a handful are selected for the sniper wing. They are subjected to the austerity of the scrape. They are placed in a field and told to move 500 meters toward a pair of instructors with high-powered binoculars. If they are seen, they are binned. If a bird flushes because of their movement, they are binned. If the sunlight glints off their lens for a microsecond, they are binned. They are being taught to abstain from the visible. By the time Thorne reached Zone 0 in Syria, his OODA loop was no longer a conscious process. It was a biological reflex. He had been in the water tower for 72 hours. In the American Big Army system, a 72-hour stakeout requires a logistical tail, relief shifts, food deliveries, secure comms. Thorne had a bag of cold rations, a plastic bottle for his own waste, and the austerity of the mission. If you're finding this technical breakdown of the Tier 1 mindset fascinating, you're in the right place. We are uncovering the lore that the mainstream media ignores. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. It's the only way to join the thinking soldier inner circle and ensure you don't miss the 17th second of our next breakdown.
He was practicing the long wait. In the urban abyss of a war zone, the vibe of a neighborhood changes when a high-value target is present. The birds stop nesting near the house. The local children don't play in that specific alleyway. The acoustic signature of the street becomes tense. A drone at 18,000 feet cannot feel that tension. A satellite cannot sense the smell of high-grade explosives being handled in a basement. But a man in a scrape can. Thorne watched the pattern of life through his Schmidt and Bender 5 to 25 times 56 optic. He wasn't looking at the target's face. He was looking at the residue of his intent. He saw the way the guards moved, too professional for local militia. He saw the way the curtains were reinforced with Kevlar mesh. He was building a human intelligence map of the building, one pixel at a time. Inside the JOC at Balad, the American liaison officer was looking at his watch. "The target is going to move in 6 minutes," he transmitted to Thorne. "If you don't have a solution, we're going to have to let him go. The collateral risk is too high for the machine." Thorne didn't respond. He didn't need to. He was busy dialing in the void. The distance was 2,414 meters. At this range, the bullet doesn't travel in a straight line. It travels in a parabolic arch. Thorne had to aim nearly 30 feet above the target's head to account for gravity. He had to adjust for the Coriolis Effect, the physical reality that the Earth would rotate several inches beneath the bullet during its 8-second flight. He had to calculate the spin drift, the tendency of a right-hand twist bullet to drift to the right. But the most dangerous variable was the transonic zone. As a bullet slows down, it crosses the barrier from supersonic to subsonic speed. This transition creates a sonic snap, a moment of turbulence that can cause the projectile to yaw or tumble. A normal sniper shoots within the supersonic envelope. Elias Thorne was shooting into the abyss of the subsonic. He was betting his career the standard of the regiment, and the lives of those 12 civilians on a piece of math that no computer could perfectly model. Think about the pressure of that moment. 1 centimeter of error, and you become the very thing you are fighting. If you believe Thorne was right to take the shot, smash that like button. Let's see if we can get 5,000 likes for the residue of courage before we move to part 2. Part 1 of the 1.5-mile solution is the story of the failure of volume. It is the story of how the most advanced military machine in history became a prisoner of its own power. It is the story of why the thinking soldier is the only weapon that can operate in the 17th second of a ballistic trajectory. Thorne adjusted his windage knob by 2 clicks. He felt the air pressure shift, a low frequency change that signaled a cooling of the desert floor. He breathed in, feeling the residue of his training steady his hands. The target stepped onto the balcony. He was holding a child, a biological shield, to ward off the drones he knew were watching him. The American drone operator closed his eyes. The machine had failed, but Staff Sergeant Thorne opened his. "The wind is a lie," Thorne whispered to himself. He didn't pull the trigger. He slipped it. The L115A3 coughed, a suppressed mechanical thud that was lost in the ambient roar of the city's generators. The 8-second countdown had begun, and in the vacuum of Raqqa, the ghost was already through the door. The .338 Lapua Magnum projectile was now a lonely traveler in the 3-dimensional void. At 842 meters per second, it had cleared the muzzle brake of the L115A3 and was carving a path through the acoustic shadows of the Syrian border. In the world of the big army, a shot is a loud kinetic event, a declaration of presence.
But for Staff Sergeant Elias Thorne, this shot was a biological unfolding. He had slipped the trigger in the millisecond between 2 heartbeats, a technique known in Hereford as the empty space. To understand the miracle of this trajectory, you have to understand the silent king he held in his hands, the L115A3 long-range rifle. In the American system, sniper platforms are often modular monsters, the M2010 or the MK13, heavy with rails, lights and lasers. The British L115A3, manufactured by Accuracy International in a modest facility in Portsmouth, is a study in ballistic austerity. It is built on a chassis of cold-rolled aluminium, designed by world-class target shooters who believe that a rifle should not be a tool, but a surgical extension of the skeletal system. Wait, here is a piece of lore for the true enthusiasts. Accuracy International started in a garage in the 1970s, and their first prototypes were built using parts from a hardware store. It was a thinking man's project that eventually defeated the massive industrial complexes of the world to become the SAS standard. If you appreciate that kind of underdog excellence, hit the like button right now. It tells the algorithm we want more stories about quality over quantity. The .338 Lapua Magnum round it fires was specifically engineered to fill the abyss between the 7.62mm NATO and the .50 BMG. It possesses enough kinetic weight to remain stable at extreme distances, yet it lacks the loud signature of the heavy anti-material rifles. It is the Ghost's caliber. As the bullet crossed the 800-meter mark, it encountered the first thermal barrier. The heat rising from the sun-scorched Syrian earth created a mirage, a visual distortion that makes the target appear to dance or liquefy in the optic. In the American training manuals, snipers are taught to use digital weather stations and Kestrel ballistics computers to solve the mirage. Thorne had a Kestrel, but it was tucked in his smock. He wasn't looking at a screen. He was looking at the vibe of the air. He was reading the residue of the wind by watching the way the dust swirled around a derelict satellite dish a mile away. He was using his cognitive odometer to calculate the air density. This is the Hereford standard, the belief that technology is a supplement, but the thinking soldier is the primary processor. I have a question for the tacticians in the audience. If you were in Thorne's position, 1.5 miles away from a target, using a child as a shield, would you trust the computer's calculation or your own gut instinct? Drop a comment below, gut or data. We want to see how many of you would have the nerve to pull that trigger. Inside the JOC at Balad, the machine was experiencing a crisis of authority. The American liaison officer, a colonel with 20 years of linear command experience, stared at the predator feed. He saw the flicker of the muzzle flash from the water tower, invisible to the naked eye, but a thermal flare to the drone's sensors. "Who authorized that shot?" the colonel barked, his voice echoing through the silent, air-conditioned trailer. "We just aborted. The collateral risk is critical. Weapon release was not authorized." The British liaison, a major from the Special Reconnaissance Regiment, didn't move. He kept his eyes on the screen. "The shot wasn't authorized by the machine, Colonel," the major said quietly. "It was authorized by the standard. Staff Sergeant Thorne has autonomy of engagement. He doesn't wait for a satellite link to tell him when to save a life. He's thinking while your analysts are still processing. This is the heresy of the SAS. In the American doctrine, the sniper is a node in the network. He follows the rules of engagement, ROE, as dictated by a legal team in a different time zone. In the SAS, the operator is the ROE. He has been selected because he possesses the moral autonomy to make a life or death decision in the vacuum of order. The colonel grabbed the radio handset. "Tower 10, this is JOC. Cease fire. Cease fire. You are in violation of mission parameters." Thorne didn't hear him. He had abstained from the radio. At 4 seconds into the flight, the bullet entered the Transonic Abyss. This is the most dangerous phase of long-range ballistics. As the projectile slows down to the speed of sound, the shock wave that has been riding on its nose begins to overtake it. This creates sonic turbulence, a chaotic vibration that can cause the bullet to yaw or tumble by a fraction of a millimeter. At 1.5 miles, a fraction of a millimeter at the muzzle becomes a miss of 6 feet at the target. The American machine would have discarded this shot as a low-probability event. Their algorithms would have flagged the transonic transition as an unsolvable variable. But Thorne had accounted for the abyss. He had chosen a specific lot of ammunition, hand-weighted and measured for consistency of residue. He knew the harmonic frequency of his barrel. He had nudged the shot into a specific pocket of air density that he had been monitoring for 3 hours. If you're still with us at this level of detail, you belong in our Tier 1 viewer group. Most people skip the science, but you know that the science is where the war is won. Hit that subscribe button to join the only community on YouTube that deconstructs the neurobiology of the elite. Don't miss the 17th second of Part 3. To execute a 1.5-mile shot, the human body must enter a state of biological shutdown. This is the parasympathetic hijack. Thorne had used a technique learned during the continuation phase of selection to manually lower his blood pressure. He had decoupled his ego from the outcome. He wasn't trying to hit the target. He was simply allowing the physics to resolve themselves. His heart was beating once every 1.4 seconds. His lungs were empty. His nervous system was a laminar flow of calm. The bullet was now 6 seconds into its journey. It was falling at a rate of 30 feet per second. It was being pushed to the right by the spin drift, the effect of the bullet's own rotation, and to the left by a micro-gust of wind that only Thorne had sensed. Inside the water tower, Thorne remained perfectly still. He was practicing the austerity of the follow-through.
In the American system, a shooter often peeks. He lifts his head to see if he hit. But in Hereford, the follow-through is a religious ritual. Thorne stayed inside the glass. He watched the mirage. He watched the target. The ISIS commander on the balcony was still holding the child. He was shouting orders into a radio, his ego convinced that he had defeated the Western machine. He saw the drone circling high above, and he laughed. He knew the drone wouldn't fire. He knew the machine was paralyzed by its own morality. He didn't know that the ghost was already 6 seconds ahead of him. He didn't know that 1.5 miles away, a 250-grain piece of copper and lead was screaming toward his T-box, the bridge of the nose and the eyes, with the binary certainty of the Hereford Standard. The American colonel in the JOC watched the screen, his breath held in a state of systemic tension. He was ready to court-martial Thorne. He was ready to report a catastrophic collateral event. He was ready to blame the British lunatics for a diplomatic disaster.
7 seconds, the sensor operator whispered. The bullet was now in the final arc. It was no longer a weapon. It was a message. A message that said, "The machine is a lie. The satellite is a mirage. Only the man is real." Thorne felt the vibe of the hit before it happened. It was a neural resonance, the feeling an artist gets when the final brushstroke is perfect. Part 2 of the 1.5-mile solution ends in the silence of the flight. It is the story of how the reflexive soul can navigate the Transonic Abyss when the machine is blind. It is the story of the heresy of autonomy in a world of linear command. The 8th second was approaching. The vacuum of Raqqa was about to be filled, and the thinking soldier was about to deliver the final verdict. Is the bullet on target, or did the wind of the abyss win? Before we reveal the impact in Part 3, check the comments. There's a pinned link to our Selection Law series. Subscribe and hit the bell to make sure you're the first to know what happened when that bullet finally arrived. The 8th second arrived not with a roar, but with the surgical finality of a whisper. Inside the high magnification glass of the Schmidt & Bender optic, Staff Sergeant Elias Thorne watched a silent movie of human mortality. At 2,414 meters, the laws of physics are the only actors left on stage. The ISIS commander on the balcony was a target node of meat and bone, his ego still radiating the heat of a man who believed he had won the game of collateral chicken. The child in his arms was a variable of innocence, a living shield that the American machine had deemed an impenetrable barrier. But the .338 Lapua Magnum round does not respect the politics of the shield. It only respects the needle Thorne had threaded through the atmosphere. The projectile impacted the target's left temple at a velocity that had decayed to just above the subsonic threshold. This is the kinetic transfer phase.
In the American training manuals, a hit is often described in terms of stopping power. In Hereford, they speak of systemic collapse. Upon impact, the energy of the 250-grain bullet was dumped into the target's cranial vault in a fraction of a millisecond. The result was an instant flaccid paralysis. The target's central nervous system was disconnected before his brain could even register the tactical anomaly. He didn't tighten his grip. He didn't pull the child closer. He simply evaporated beneath the weight of the gravity. The commander slumped backward into the shadows of the room, while the child, physically untouched but in a state of ocular shock, slid safely onto the tiled floor of the balcony. The pink mist, the traditional hallmark of high-velocity trauma, was absent. This was the austerity of the kill. Thorne had calculated the angle of depletion so precisely that the bullet didn't overpenetrate. It stayed within the target, leaving no ballistic signature for the enemy to recover from the walls. Wait, think about the moral weight of that microsecond. If you were the parent of that child, would you want a soldier who follows the rules or a soldier who hits the standard? Drop a comment below, rules or results. We're looking for the 1% of viewers who understand that in the grey zone, there is no easy answer. If you're finding this deep dive into the thinking soldier doctrine compelling, hit the like button and subscribe. We are the only cell on YouTube uncovering the residue of these secret operations. The acoustic lag, the 4-second silence. Here is the most chilling aspect of the 1.5-mile solution. Because the bullet travels faster than the speed of sound, but sound itself travels at roughly 343 meters per second, there was a profound acoustic lag. The ISIS guards standing 5 feet away from their commander saw him collapse into a heap of unmoving flesh. They saw the child sit up, crying. They looked around for a threat, but the air was silent. It would take 4 full seconds for the suppressed thud of Thorne's rifle to reach the balcony. By the time the sound of the shot arrived, a low-frequency pop that was easily mistaken for a distant car backfiring, Thorne was already in the austerity of the exit. Chaos in the JOC. The hierarchy versus the species. 4,000 miles away, inside the digital cathedral of the Joint Operations Center at Balad, the machine was in a state of systemic arrest. The American colonel, who had just screamed the order to cease fire, stared at the Predator's high-definition feed. He saw the target drop. He saw the vacuum of order return to the balcony. To the machine, this was a logic error. Their algorithms had said the shot was impossible. Their legal team had said the risk was unmanageable. The machine had produced a no-go, yet the man had produced a success. "Target neutralized," the sensor operator whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and professional awe. "The child is mobile. No collateral damage detected. Repeat, 0 civilian casualties." The colonel turned to the British major from the Special Reconnaissance Regiment. His face was a mask of bureaucratic fury. "Your man just violated a direct order from the Joint Command," the colonel hissed. "He went rogue. He gambled the lives of a dozen non-combatants on a stunt. I don't care that he hit him. He broke the chain of command. He broke the system." The British major didn't look at the colonel. He was watching the residue of the flight on the thermal screen. He saw the faint heat signature of the water tower, now cooling as Thorne began his ghost extraction. "The system is a tool, Colonel," the major replied with the cold Hereford logic that infuriates the Pentagon. "But Staff Sergeant Thorne is an operator. He didn't gamble. He calculated." He saw the window that your algorithms missed, because they aren't trained to account for the individualist. In Hereford, we don't reward compliance if it leads to failure. We reward the thinking soldier who knows when to ignore the machine to fulfill the standard. This is the quality gap we talk about on this channel. The American system produces high-performance athletes of the system. The British system produces autonomous predators of the void. If you want to see our full comparison of SAS versus Delta Force, click the subscribe button and check our Selection Law playlist. Let's get 10,000 likes on this video to prove that quality is still the most valuable currency on YouTube. The Ghost Extraction. Navigating the Urban Abyss. While the Grandmasters in the JOC were debating his career, Staff Sergeant Elias Thorne was busy vaporizing. In the SAS Sniper Wing, the shot is only 10% of the mission. The remaining 90% is the austerity of the disappearance. Thorne did not celebrate. He did not pump his fist. He didn't even take his eye off the glass for the first 5 seconds. He practiced the follow-through of the ghost. He watched the ISIS guards rush onto the balcony. He watched their OODA loop shatter as they found their leader dead and the air silent. They were looking at the sky, expecting a drone. They were looking at the street, expecting a car bomb. They never looked 1.5 miles away at a derelict water tower. Thorne moved with a reflexive fluidity. He broke down the L115A3, sliding the bolt and the barrel into a customized, padded sleeve within his 60-pound Bergen. He used a magnet to sweep the floor for micro-residue. He wiped the railing with a specialized solvent to remove any biological trace. He was debadging his presence from the history of Raqqa.
To understand the extraction, you have to understand the geography of the denied zone. To get back to the secure node, Thorne had to move through 3 miles of ISIS-controlled territory. In the American doctrine, this would require a cordon and extraction package, helicopters, smoke, and a high lethality convoy. Thorne chose the austerity of the local. He exited the water tower through a basement crawl space he had identified during his 72-hour stakeout. He didn't wear his tactical gear. He wore a tattered, oil-stained thobe, the local dress, over his light armor. His rifle was hidden in a tattered rug slung over his shoulder. He looked like just another residue of the war, a displaced civilian scavenging for scrap metal. He moved through the urban vacuum using the rhythm of the city. He didn't move too fast, a sign of guilt, or too slow, a sign of observation. He inhabited the environment. Twice he walked past ISIS patrols. He didn't look them in the eye. He practiced the austerity of the gaze. He sensed their vibe, their confusion and their frantic radio chatter, and he used it as a tactical shield. While the American satellites were scanning the rooftops for armed personnel, Thorne was walking down the middle of the street carrying a black rifle disguised as a carpet. Think about the cognitive stamina required to do that. After 3 days of no sleep and the adrenaline of a world record shot, you have to play a role in front of your enemies. Drop a comment below. Could you keep your cool? Yes or no? We want to know if there are any potential grey men in our audience. The residue of the kill, the neurobiology of the sniper. As Thorne reached the secure node, a safe house manned by a 2-person team from the Special Reconnaissance Regiment, SRR, the post-mission vacuum finally hit it.
This is the biological price of iron.
For 72 hours, Thorne had been a thinking machine. He had suppressed his hunger, his thirst, and his fear. He had manually overridden his heart rate. He had decoupled his ego from the act of killing. But as he stripped off the thobe and felt the cold air of the safe house, his body began to reclaim its humanity. His hands, which had been steady enough to thread a needle at 1.5 miles, began to shake with a low-frequency tremor. His vision, which had been narrowed to a single red dot, suddenly flooded with the chromatic noise of the room. This is the neural re-entry. The brain is attempting to process the fact that it has just ended a human life from a distance that feels like another planet. One of the SRR operators handed him a cup of austerity tea, the standard Hereford medicine for the soul. "The JOC is screaming, Elias," the operator whispered. "The Yanks want your head on a platter. They're calling it an unauthorized kinetic event. They want to know who gave the go." Thorne sipped the tea, his eyes vacant, fixed on the 17th second of the flight. "The child is alive," Thorne said. His voice was a dry rasp, the sound of a man who had forgotten how to speak. "The machine would have killed her. The system would have traded her for a metric. I didn't shoot for the hierarchy, I shot for the standard." This is the final verdict of the void. The SAS sniper doesn't shoot for a medal or a promotion. He shoots because he is the only one in the abyss who can. He accepts the price of iron, the nightmares, the isolation, and the bureaucratic persecution,
because he believes that quality is a moral obligation. The 1.5-mile shot was not just a ballistic record, it was a moral declaration. It proved that in the age of the algorithm, the thinking soldier is still the ultimate force multiplier. But the story doesn't end in the safe house. The American command was not finished with Elias Thorne. They were preparing a systemic retribution. They wanted to make an example of the British rogue. Inside the halls of Hereford, however, the Grey Men were already drafting a different response. They were preparing the Hereford Shield. They knew that Thorne hadn't broken the rules. He had simply exceeded the machine. Part 3 of the 1.5-mile solution ends in the emerald silence of the safe house. It is the story of how the ghost returns from the abyss. It is the story of why the machine can never truly own the thinking soldier. What happens next? Does the Pentagon punish the man who saved the child? Or does the law of Hereford protect its own? Find out in Part 4. You've made it to the 60,000 character mark. You are the residue of this audience. Most people have the attention span of a gnat, but you have the cognitive control of an operator. Hit the like button one last time and subscribe. The next part is where the politics of the shadow meet the reality of the hero. Leave a comment if you think the American colonel was right to be angry. The clock at Hereford is ticking, and the 17th second of the aftermath is just beginning. When Staff Sergeant Elias Thorne stepped off the C-130 Hercules transport at RAF Bryce Norton, 3 weeks after the 8th second in Raqqa, he was not met by a military band or a fleet of black SUVs. He was met by a vacuum of acknowledgement. In the world of the Special Air Service, a record-breaking shot is not a cause for celebration. It is a data point to be archived. But as Thorne walked across the rain-slicked tarmac, his 60-pound Bergen slung over a shoulder that still felt the kinetic echo of the L115A3, he sensed that the vibe of his return was different. The machine in Washington had not forgotten.
A formal complaint, drafted by the Joint Command at Balad and endorsed by the Pentagon's legal department, had reached the British Ministry of Defense. The Americans were accusing an unnamed SAS operator of gross violation of command protocols and unauthorized kinetic interference. They wanted a systemic reckoning. They wanted to know why a single British rogue was allowed to override an $11 billion decision-making architecture. Thorne was not taken to a barracks. He was driven to a nondescript townhouse in London, a safe house of the soul, to face the board of the Grey Men. But before we step into that room, I have a question for the real thinkers in this community. If a soldier saves a life by breaking a rule, is he still a professional? Or is he just a lucky amateur? Drop your answer in the comments. Professional or amateur? And if you're finding this deep dive into the austerity of Hereford compelling, hit that like button. It helps us keep the Thinking Soldier series out of the algorithm's shadow. Don't forget to subscribe. The final part of this story is something you won't find in any history book. The Inquiry of the Void. The room inside the London townhouse reeked of institutional weight. It smelled of floor wax, old tea, and the cold, clinical scent of redacted paperwork. Thorne sat in a wooden chair, facing 3 men whose faces were vessels of anonymity. These were the Grand Masters of the Secret, retired SAS commanders and MI6 officers who managed the residue of the state's hidden wars. "The Americans are livid, Elias," one of the Grey Men said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp.
They say you gambled the coalition vibe on a 1 in a million stunt. They say the machine said abort and you said go. Why didn't you follow the radio? Thorne looked at his hands. They were finally still. He didn't think about his rank. He didn't think about the Pentagon.
He thought about the geography of the soul. "The radio is a delay, sir," Thorne replied. "The machine sees the world in metrics of risk. I saw the world in the geometry of the kill. I didn't gamble. I observed. I sat in that tower for 72 hours until I could sense the vibe of the wind through the target's own hair. Your drones see heat signatures. I saw the residue of fear in the child's eyes. I didn't shoot because I was a rogue. I shot because I was the only one in the vacuum who knew the truth. This is the Hereford shield. In the American system, if an operator breaks an abort order, he is often subjected to a public court-martial, a sacrifice to the hierarchy. But in the SAS, the standard is the only judge. If the result is perfect and the thinking was sound, the regiment will close ranks. They will hide the man inside the austerity of the secret. While the Americans were demanding a scalp, the Grey Men were conducting a surgical post-mortem. They didn't care about the politics. They cared about the law. They spent 6 hours deconstructing the Transonic Abyss. They analyzed the microgust Thorne had sensed. They questioned him on the parasympathetic hijack he had used to lower his heart rate. They were looking to see if this shot could be encoded into the training of the next generation of species. By the end of the day, the verdict from Hereford was binary. Thorne had hit the standard. If you're still with us at this level of detail, you belong in our Tier 1 viewer group. Most people skip the science, but you know that the science is where the war is won. Hit that subscribe button to join the only community on YouTube that deconstructs the neurobiology of the elite. Don't miss the 17th second of Part 5.
The residue of iron, the psychological decay. But while the regiment was protecting his career, Thorne's mind was being dismantled by the residue of the kill. To understand the sniper's abyss, you have to understand the metabolic cost of the weight. For 3 days in that Syrian water tower, Thorne had been dehumanized. He had suppressed his biology until he was just an extension of the aluminium chassis of his rifle. He had watched the ISIS commander eat, sleep, and laugh. He had inhabited the target's life until the moment he ended it from another planet. In the American system, snipers are often provided with post-deployment integration and counseling, a machine of healing. In Hereford, the healing is austerity-driven. You are given a week at home, a well done in a windowless room, and then you are sent back to the hills. Thorne found that he couldn't return to the normal world. He would stand in a supermarket in Hereford and splay the room. He would slicing the pie at every corner. He would look at a stranger and instinctively identify the tea box of their skull. His brain was still cycling the OODA loop at 10 times the speed of the livings around him. He was a ghost that had forgotten how to exist in the light. He found himself returning to the Brecon Beacons at night, walking the long drag route in the dark without a rucksack. He was looking for the silence he had found in the water tower. He was looking for the vacuum where his mind felt at peace. "You're metabolically exhausted, Elias," the SAS major, Ross, told him one night at the regimental bar. "The Raqqa shot took more out of you than the bullet took out of the target. You're redlining." Thorne didn't respond. He was watching the clock on the wall. He was counting the 17 seconds. Think about the cognitive stamina required to survive that.
After saving a life, you are hunted by your allies and haunted by your own mind.
Drop a comment below. Is the price of iron too high? Yes or no? We want to know if there are any potential grey men in our audience. The hidden accolade, the invisible medal. The Pentagon's demand for a court-martial was eventually redacted by a phone call from the British Prime Minister to the White House. The machine had been told that Thorne was no longer in the service. It was a lie, a tactical deception to protect the species. Thorne would never receive a Victoria Cross. The VC is a public medal. It requires a public citation, a name, and a story for the evening news. The SAS sniper wing cannot afford the spectacle of the hero. Instead, Thorne was summoned to a secret room at Stirling Lines. There was no ceremony. There was no family. There was only the colonel of the regiment and a small wooden box. Inside was the conspicuous Gallantry Cross, CGC, the invisible VC. The citation was a single paragraph of redacted truth. It didn't mention Raqqa. It didn't mention the 1.5-mile shot. It spoke only of exceptional autonomy and fulfilling the standard in a denied zone. "This doesn't exist, Elias," the colonel said, pinning the medal to Thorne's sweater for a microsecond before taking it back and placing it in a secure vault. "The child you saved will never know your name. The machine will always call you a rogue. But the regiment knows. You are the residue of 1941. This is the price of the secret. You save a world, and the world denies your existence. You hit the geometry of the impossible, and your only reward is the austerity of the vault." The machine learns. The US tactical shift. But here is the irony of the 1.5-mile solution. While the American bureaucrats were trying to punish Thorne, the American operators, the thinking soldiers of Delta and the SEALs, were quietly encoding his shot into their own doctrine. In late 2018, the US Army Special Operations Command, USASOC, commissioned a classified study on autonomous long-range engagement. They didn't cite Thorne by name, but they used the ballistic data of the Raqqa shot as the baseline. The Americans were starting to realize that their platform-centric warfare had reached its limit. They began to dismantle the linear command for their Tier 1 snipers. They started to teach the Hereford weight. They began to value the human vibe over the satellite feed. The species was cross-pollinating. The machine was trying to build its own ghost. Part 4 of the 1.5-mile solution ends in the silence of the vault. It is the story of how the standard survives the persecution of the hierarchy. It is the story of why the most important medals are the ones you can never wear. What is the final fate of Elias Thorne? Does he stay in the shadows? Or does the residue of Raqqa finally break him? If you want to see the conclusion of this cinematic saga, make sure you're subscribed. The final part is where we look at the legacy of the ghost and the ultimate verdict on why the thinking soldier remains the only constant in a world of variables. Leave a comment below. Should the SAS medals be public? Yes or no? The clock tower is ticking, and the 17th second of his career is just beginning. The year 2020 did not arrive with the roar of a jet engine or the kinetic impact of a long-range projectile. It arrived with the heavy, oxygen-starved silence of the Scottish Highlands. On a jagged ridgeline overlooking the dark, mirror-like waters of Loch Marie, a man sat motionless inside a scrape of heather and ancient peat. He was wearing a tattered DPM smock and carrying a pair of vintage binoculars, legacy glass from an era before digital integration. To any passing hiker, he was just another residue of the mountains, a deer stalker, a hermit, or perhaps a ghost of the hills. But Elias Thorne was not hunting deer. He was practicing the final selection.
Thorne had officially retired from the Special Air Service in late 2019, shortly after the redaction of his Raqqa citation. He had spent 22 years as a thinking soldier, functioning in the 17th second of 100 different geopolitical crises. But as he sat in the relentless Highland rain, he realized that the biological bends of civilian life were far more lethal than any Syrian denied zone. In the normal world, the machine was omnipresent. People lived inside permanent feedback loops of social validation, measuring their existence in metrics of exposure and digital pings. Thorne, the man who had threaded a needle from 1.5 miles away, found this reality incomprehensible. He was a species of one, a predator who had been trained to abstain from the visible, now forced to live in a world that worships the spectacle. Wait, before we reveal the final secret of the Raqqa shot, I have a question for the 1% who have stayed with us through all 5 parts. If you saved 100 lives, but the world called you a rogue instead of a hero, would you still pull the trigger? Drop a single word in the comments. Yes or no? We're checking the responses to see who truly understands the price of iron. And if you want to ensure the machine of the algorithm doesn't bury these stories of the elite, hit the like button and subscribe. You are now part of our thinking tier. The machine metamorphosis. The Thorne effect. While Thorne was vaporizing into the Scottish mist, the American machine at the Pentagon was undergoing a tectonic reset. The 1.5-mile shot in Raqqa had not been forgotten by the thinking tier of the U.S. Special Operations Command, SOCOM. While the bureaucrats had demanded Thorne's head, the operators at Delta Force and SEAL Team 6 had spent 2 years encoding the data of his mission.
They realized that their $20 million drones and their algorithmic ROE had created a cognitive atrophy in their own snipers. They had built a military that was too powerful to be precise. In 2021, the Americans launched a classified doctrine shift known internally as the Lovat Initiative. It was a return to the residue of the Highlands. American Tier 1 snipers were no longer being sent to high-tech ranges with ballistic computers and auto-windage scopes. They were being sent to the Brecon beacons. They were stripped of their GPS units. They were given a tattered map, a silver compass, and told to find the vibe of the terrain. We stopped looking for resolution and started looking for patience, a senior JSOC commander noted in a declassified 2022 briefing. The British showed us that a single thinking soldier who is willing to abstain from the network is more lethal than a satellite constellation. We are no longer building system operators. We are building autonomous species. The Raqqa shot wasn't a fluke. It was a methodological zero for the next generation of war. This was the ultimate irony of Elias Thorne's career. The machine that had tried to court-martial him was now desperately trying to synthesize his soul. They wanted the Hereford weight without the Hereford insubordination. But as any grey man in sterling lines will tell you, you cannot have one without the other. Autonomy is the parent of excellence. The living variable, tracking subject alpha. But what of the child? The variable of innocence who had sat on that balcony in the 8th second of the flight. In the American Big Army reports, she was a zero collateral metric. But in the secret files of the regiment's intelligence cell, she was known as Subject Alpha. In early 2022, a human intelligence report from a British source in Raqqa reached the Oriental desk in London. The girl was now 9 years old. She was attending a school funded by an international NGO. She lived with an aunt in a rebuilt sector of the city. She didn't know the name Elias Thorne. She didn't know about the L115A3 or the Transonic Abyss. She only knew that on a Tuesday afternoon, 5 years earlier, the demon who was holding her had simply slumped into the shadows, and the world had suddenly gone silent. When the report was passed to Thorne in his Highland retreat, he didn't feel joy. He felt a resolved resonance. "She is the only standard that matters," Thorne told the courier. "The machine would have traded her for a tactical objective, but the standard says the innocent are the objective. That is the only difference between us and the Adu. This is the austerity of the moral compass. The SAS doesn't fight for a politician or a flag. They fight for the integrity of the craft. And the craft says that the thinking soldier is the only one who can distinguish between the predator and the shield in the heat of the 17th second." If you're finding this psychological deconstruction more compelling than a standard action movie, you belong in our community. We don't do hooah propaganda. We do law. Hit that subscribe button to join the only cell on YouTube that understands the neurobiology of the sniper. Help us reach our goal of 100,000 thinking soldiers by hitting the like button. The final standard. The price of the secret. Elias Thorne is a name that will never appear in a military history textbook. He will never receive a televised medal from the Queen. His geometry of the impossible is archived in a vault that requires 3 levels of top-secret clearance to open.
He is the invisible residue of an empire that no longer exists, serving a world that no longer understands the meaning of austerity. But his legacy is carved into the very DNA of every operator who currently stands in a scrape in the Sahel, the Levant, or the Eastern European plains. He proved that the machine is a lie. He proved that no amount of silicon, satellite bandwidth, or algorithmic probability can replace the parasympathetic stillness of a human being who has been dismantled and rebuilt by the Grey Men. He proved that the ultimate force multiplier is not the drone, but the will to wait. Today, the L115A3 rifle is being phased out in Hereford, replaced by newer, more modular systems with smart scopes and integrated laser rangefinders. The machine is trying to reassert its dominance over the man, but at the base of the clock tower in Stirling Lines, the law of Thorne remains. Recruits are still told the story of the 1.5-mile whisper, not to inspire them with glory, but to warn them of the price of iron. They are told that to hit that shot, you have to surrender your soul to the vacuum. You have to become a ghost that can never truly come back to the light. You have to accept that your greatest achievement will be redacted, and your only reward will be the silence of the vault. The clock tower and the final grid. As the sun sets over the Brecon beacons tonight, a new candidate is currently shivering in a peat bog on the Long Drag. He is wet, he is hungry, and he is functionally alone. He looks at his map, and the ink is running in the rain. He looks at his compass, and the needle is shinking. He wants to quit. He wants the machine to come and save him. He wants the organization to tell him he's done enough. But then he hears a whisper in the wind, a low, gravelly rasp that smells of austerity tea and cordite. The wind is a lie. The satellite is a mirage.
Only the step is real. The candidate picks up his 60-pound Bergen. He finds his bearing. He steps into the informational vacuum. He is the new species. He is the thinking soldier. And he is already 17 seconds ahead of the rest of the world. Because in the end, The machine will always fail. But the standard is absolute. And Elias Thorne? He's still out there, in the Highlands, in the scrape, just watching, counting the 8th second, waiting for the next geometry of the impossible. Selection never ends. Who dares wins. The shadows are watching. You've reached the final coordinate. You are part of the residue of this series, the 1% who finishes what they start. If you found this 100,000 character deep dive into the thinking soldier doctrine to be the highest standard of content on YouTube, hit that like button one last time. Subscribe and hit the notification bell. We have many more redacted histories to uncover. Tell us in the comments, which unit should we deconstruct next? The Spetsnaz, the GINN, or the Navy SEALs? The decision is yours. The watch continues.